Hello and welcome to a brand new section on my site. I actually started filming a Watercolour 101 as part of my 101 series, and I started it and I realised I have far too much to say about watercolour to make one 101 video, and the point of 101s is they're self-contained and complete. So this is a new series, The Spin Doctor's Surgery, which covers watercolour basics, and what you can do, as always, is you can comment below and ask questions and I'll answer them. And what I'm hoping to do is, as time moves on, start doing like an hour a week of live stuff, so that people can ask questions and I'll do stuff live in response to that, because I think that'll help people. So the point of this first surgery really is just to talk about paints and what you need if you're an absolute newcomer to watercolouring, you have never done any before whatsoever. You're going to need less than 10 colours of paint. So before you go out and buy anything, watch this video, learn what you need, and don't make the most common mistakes. I do not get paid by any company to recommend their products. I do not have any free paints to review at the moment. I recommend what I use, and when I began watercolour I always used Cotman, which is Winsor & Newton's student brand. Winsor & Newton sell several grades of watercolour paint. They have a really good quality artist watercolour, which is just called Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolour, and that's what I usually paint with in my videos. They also have their student grade, which is called Cotman, and what student grade means in the context of paint is slightly lower quality to make it cheaper so that beginners can afford to buy it. And just to give you an idea, one tube of professional quality can cost more than a whole set of student quality. And when you go shopping, and you'll see in the description of this video, I've done some links to UK and US vendors so you can buy the materials I cover in these videos, and you can just buy all the things I recommend in one place, a little shopping list for you, and I will try and find the cheapest way to buy them on those vendors. But for those of you in America, and I know most of my audience are in America, shops like Jerry's Artorama and some of the big box stores, if you have a coupon, I know you can get things even cheaper. I link to US Amazon because I have an affiliate set up with them, so I get a tiny bit of commission on every sale, but you don't pay a penny more than you normally would. That's important to stress. And I have one with Dick Blick as well, but they don't always have as good prices, so I always link to whoever's got the best price at the time. So, Cotman sell what is known as their Sketchers set. This is a really nice little simple set of pan watercolours. Now, I started out with Cotman in tubes. Watercolour comes in basically two main varieties. There's the tube version, which is a squishy liquid paint. You can either paint with directly, or you can put it into a palette and dry it, and it goes kind of rubbery, and then you can re-wet that as many times as you like and reuse it. And that's actually what I do. That's what probably most watercolourists do, because it means we can use whatever palette we want to use in whatever shape we like, and we can use it straight from the tube if we want. But as a beginner, let's take a complication away from you. What we're going to suggest you use in this video is what is known as a pan. Now, a pan of watercolour is watercolour, similar composition, squishy, juicy watercolour, that has been put into a container or into a mould, or a machine actually usually, and it is made very, very viscous, and it is compressed through a small opening to make a kind of sausage, which is then chopped into small pieces, and these are then baked so they shrink and go hard, and they're sold in various sizes. And these sizes are known as a half pan and a full pan, and there's now something on the market called a large pan. These are large pans, which you absolutely don't need to concern yourself with as a beginner, but you can see what the texture of the paint looks like. It's like a big rubbery block, and on this one I can actually lift it out so you can see it's like a sheet of thick rubbery hard paint. Put a bit of water on that, you can wet it instantly, it just dries up, you can reuse it, and no mess, no worrying about juicy liquid paints everywhere in tubes. So we're going to concentrate on pans. Rather than a large pan or even a full pan, I'm recommending you start with half pans. So the Sketchers set has half pans, and this is what a half pan looks like. They are little tiny plastic tub. That plastic tub is called a half pan, and something double the length but the same width, so it would be like two of them together, is a full pan. The block of paint within it that you can see there, that yellow paint, is sometimes also called a half pan, but that's the block of paint within it. The Sketchers set gives you the 6 colours you really need, plus some that you really don't need, and I'm going to recommend you start by taking those out, putting them away in a drawer, don't throw them, and either add in some other colours that are more useful, or stick to what we call a limited palette, i.e. a very small range of colours until you're confident with colour theory. So what you have in here are lemon yellow hue, and I'll explain what hue means in a moment, cadmium yellow hue, cadmium red hue, alizarin crimson hue, intense blue, and ultramarine, and they're your 6 main colours you're going to need, and they are, for each colour you'll notice there's 2 yellows, 2 reds, 2 blues. That's because you have a cool blue and a warm blue, a cool red and a warm red, a cool yellow and a warm yellow and a cool yellow. I always get the yellows the wrong way around in my head, I don't know why. There's also some other colours. There's 2 greens, Viridian, which is a very bluish green, and sap green. You don't need those, so ignore those. You're going to take those out of the set. There are 3 earth tones, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and burnt umber, and there's also a white, Chinese white. I would like you, if you start with this set, or you buy the half pans individually and do it yourself, do not use the Viridian, the sap green, the burnt umber, or the Chinese white to start with. So cut this down to 8 half pans. Put the others in a drawer. In fact, the white you're probably never going to use. We don't use white in watercolour, and you'll see why in a moment. That gives you a warm and a cool of each of the 3 primary colours, plus a yellow ochre, plus a burnt sienna. And that is what you need to paint an awful lot of things, and you are not going to need those other colours. The brush in here is not a very good brush. It's a travel brush. It's not great. Again, put it to one side. I'm going to make you some brush recommendations in just a moment. Now, when you're working with those colours, the reason I've suggested you work on a restricted palette is really simple. The more colours you have, actually the harder it is to paint, because you've got more different variables to control. And in reality, I have never painted normally with more than 5 colours in a painting, because obviously you mix them to make all the other colours. I have got a painting on the go at the moment that I'm doing actually from a tutorial, because I couldn't believe it worked, which used 15 different paints. I'm 3/4 of the way through it, and I'm doing it because I couldn't believe something with 15 colours could look nice. But it does, but it's a hell of a lot of work because you've got so many things you need to control. Now, no 2 colours are created equal, and that's a really important point with watercolour. You might see 2 blues and think, well, they're almost identical shades. Why on earth do people have them? Both. Why would someone have both of those? And it may be that one is more transparent than the other. It may be that one granulates or one stains. And if you look in the iCards now, I've got a video on granulation versus staining, so you can learn what those terms mean, because I'm not going to cover them in this video. So you just have to trust that we use all sorts of paints because we like different effects, and certain paints work better together than certain other pairs of paints work, and that's another consideration to make. But with that limited palette, you're going to be able to do a lot of things. A piece of nomenclature for you: the word hue means fake. It is a declared fake. So if I sell a paint and call it cadmium red, it has to really contain a cadmium-based pigment. If I call it cadmium red hue, what that means is I have approximated the colour, but nothing else, of cadmium red real paint, so that you can save money because cadmium pigments are very expensive, and so that the toxicity issue, which is actually nonsense, unless you eat paint, cadmium is not a problem with paint, really. There is a bit of scaremongering going on about it at the moment in the art community, but really, as Cinnamon Cooney says, don't eat paint and you're absolutely fine. And I've got a video coming up to kind of deal with some of that scaremongering myself. So, what I would say is hues are fine when you're starting out because they give you the right colour. What you might find is if you watch someone like me or Lindsay the Frugal Crafter or someone else doing a tutorial with cadmium red and cadmium yellow real paints, You might find when you're painting with them that the texture of the colours looks different, like because cadmium paints granulate, and you can watch that video I mentioned before, but your hues may not granulate. That's because hues only approximate the colour. They don't approximate the opacity or the texture. They're only there to give the colour the same, hence the word hue, meaning colour tone. So that's what you're going to be starting out with. Now, what do I mean by warm and cool? I'm going to be doing a separate video on colour theory that you can watch, and if I think about it, I'll come back to this video and add it to the iCards if I think about it. But otherwise, go and have a look on my channel for a video in my 101 series called Colour Theory. There is a 101s playlist, and you can find it in there. Warm and cool simply mean, in terms of the colour wheel, where things fit. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a colour wheel here because I want to explain some techniques and it's a good medium through which to teach them. So I'm going to divide up this piece of paper approximately into thirds, and then I'm going to divide each third in half again. And what that's going to give me is space to do a number of colours. Now, in reality, I'm only going to use a warm and a cool, a warm and a cool, and a warm and a cool. I'm going to concentrate on the mixtures we get in between them. So the primaries, as you probably remember from school, are yellow, red, and blue. But if we were looking at, and you can watch my colour chemistry video on what colour actually is to understand this, there is no blue paint that is perfect blue, really. Every blue paint has got a tiny bit of yellow, so it's a slightly greenish blue, or a tiny bit of red, and it's a slightly reddish blue, a slightly purplish blue. We would call a greenish blue a cool blue, and a reddish blue a warm blue. With reds, if they're a little bit yellow, we would consider them to be a warm red. So orangey reds are warm reds. Bluish reds, purplish reds are cool reds. Yellows that are a little bit green biased, so a little bit blue, they would be a cool yellow, and yellows that are a little bit orange are a warm yellow. So not easy to remember at first, but you can work this out yourself with time. Now, in terms of what paints I'm going to use today, I'm going to also use the Cotman paints because I think it's important that I use what I'm telling you to use, but I don't want to dissect that pack and kind of get the paints out. I know I've got a larger Cotman set somewhere buried on my desk. So much stuff just went careering to the floor then. I'm actually tidying my studio and I've put loads of stuff on my desk because I'm tidying the big pile of books and things on the floor. I made a total mess. This is a bigger Cotman set called the Cotman Studio set that I've made some modifications to. Do not buy this as a beginner. It's got 45, well, it hasn't got 45 colours because some are duplicates, but it's got about 40 colours in it. It's the whole Cotman range. Don't buy it as a beginner because you're going to get yourself bogged down with the colours. However, if you see this on a really good discount, it can get down to like £25 if you're really lucky. Buy it and put it in a drawer for when you're better at painting. Because I really mean this, for the first 3 months, do not paint with anything other than the restricted palette that I've already explained to you. Simply because you're going to get bogged down too fast, and what you need to do as a beginner is absolutely master colour theory before you go anywhere, okay? Now, whilst I've recommended just those 3 colours, those 6 colours plus some earths, I'm going to mention some others in this video that you could use. Now, brushes are obviously important, and I'm going to mention to you the brush sizes and types that I think a beginner should really have. I'm not going to mention any brands because there's no need for that. I'm just going to mention some types of brush. Now, first of all, you're going to need a couple of rounds. Rounds look like this. They've got a sort of round tip to them, as you can see, and they've got size numbers. This is a number 4 round, and this is a number 8 round. And I would recommend you start out with a 4 and an 8, and you might also want a 2, which is a much smaller one as well. Now, these brushes are sable, which is animal fur, and I do not recommend a beginner ever buys a sable brush. The reason for that is an ethical one. Sable obviously has implications with animal cruelty and animal welfare, and I'm not going to get into that. And I'm also going to delete any comments about it, because I don't want my videos getting political. I'm telling you my personal view on things, and I don't honestly care what other people's view on what I do is. If you want to use Sable, use Sable. If you don't want to use Sable, don't use Sable. But I don't think it's right to be telling other people what they should and shouldn't be using. I should also know I've had these brushes for probably over 10 years, maybe even 20 years. And I make Sable last, and that is because if it comes from an animal, I think you need to respect it. So I do not think a beginner should be using Sable, because you don't quite know what you're doing with it, and you're probably going to ruin brushes a lot when you're beginning. So what I will recommend is you use a synthetic round. There's a good range by Dalon and Rowney called the Graduate range, which in North America are called Simply Simmons. If you get yourself a round in there synthetic, and you can see it here, it's quite good when you're a beginner because it doesn't hold a lot of water, and you might find it's easier to control. So you might want to get your rounds in that. If you fancy spending a little bit more money on your rounds when you're starting out, there is a very high quality synthetic called Dalon, also by Dalon and Rowney, which has a red handle. And this is a Dalon round. It's called D77 is the series number. And this is a size 12 round. And these are made to mimic Sable. They're a little bit more expensive, but if you see them on sale, they're worth getting your 8 and your 4 in that. And they won't cost you too much money. You're also going to need a flat brush. This is what's called a one stroke, which is not the same as a flat, but they're similar. So you're either going to need a one stroke or a flat that is 1/4 inch in size. And I would recommend you get a larger flat, either a 1 inch or a 1/2 inch. This is a 1 inch, and this is actually a one stroke as well. You might find something like this. This is called a Skyflow brush, which is used for painting really large areas with water before you start painting. You might find a Skyflow is actually pretty useful. And this fibre is something called gold Taklon, Taklon. Taklon comes in all sorts of colours, and gold Taklon is the one that is really kind of springy. It's designed for acrylic painting, but as a beginner watercolourist, you might find that this gives you a little bit more control than a fake Sable would, so you might find this is useful. These brushes are not expensive. This is from the Simply Gold Taklon range by Dalon and Rowney, and it's a 2 inch flat or a 2 inch Skyflow. And this brush cost me about £5, and I've had it forever, and I've used it for acrylic, which gives brushes quite a beating, but I would use it to wet a large area before I begin painting. So you might find that useful. That's why a 1 inch or bigger is a useful thing to have. And again, the Graduate or Simply Simmons range has 1 inch flats. This fibre is a mixture of horsehair and gold Taklon, which is an economical alternative, but it does hold a little bit more water. I find if you get these, you need to wash them with baby shampoo when you start, because they can be a bit greasy, which can mean you can see how shiny they are from the Taklon. And they splay. They don't give you a nice neat edge. That's one thing to bear with when you're buying them. I wouldn't go mad and buy loads of different shapes and weird sizes of brushes, though. I would stick to a small range. The other one that may be useful for you to have, and I would get it in a size 8 or a size 12, probably a size 8 as a beginner, is anything with this kind of shape at the end. And these are sold with different names. You might see it called a cat's tongue, or a filbert, or an egbert, and they are all technically different brushes, but they all kind of do the same sort of thing. They've got this sharp edge you can get into corners with. This one is a filbert. An egbert is like a filbert but longer, and I thought that was a really cute kind of parody name, but actually an egbert means a bright-edged sword in German, so it has a sort of meaningful name. Filbert means hazelnut because of the sort of shape of the brush tip. A cat's tongue is actually something slightly different, but again, it will do the same job. And you can, in that same range, the Graduate range, get something called an oval wash, which is not the same. It doesn't go into corners in the same way, but it might be a useful one to have, and that's a 1/2 inch oval wash. Oops, so sorry. I actually just ran out of memory, and I've just had to go and download all the videos off my camera and come back. As I was saying about this brush, this is made of pony synthetic, just like the one I mentioned to you previously. So you might want to start out with those brushes. Let me just move the camera over slightly in the tripod. There we go, to get you back to where you were. Right, let's see if I can just get things Sorry about that, a bit jarring for you there, but I just want to get things so we can see what I'm doing. Now, it's important with watercolour to just first understand a basic and why we don't use white. The white has already been put down for us. Watercolour is painted in the opposite direction to all other painting techniques that are known. If we were painting acrylic or oil or gouache or tempera or whatever, you put your dark colours down first and you build forwards to the lightest colours. So if we were painting a crashing wave rolling over the sand, we would probably paint the dark blue waves, and then when it's dry, paint the white crests of the waves. In watercolour, we would do the opposite. We would paint the dark crashing wave around the white areas. So we would leave those white areas plain and don't use white paint. We don't use white paint in watercolour. There's a few reserved uses of it where we do use it. There's not many of those. We would use it perhaps for sea spray, just spattered over a drawing. And we would do that with a specialist brush called a spatter brush, and they look like this. This is something you'll want to get when you're more advanced. And it's a bottle brush mounted on a fake cork, and it twists round. You could actually make one yourself from a bottle brush, and it has this spike here. And all you do is you cover the bottle brush in a white paint, and then you insert the spike into the brush and you turn this, and as it turns it flicks paint onto the page and gives you a lovely fine spray. So we use that quite often for sea spray, snow and all those kinds of things, but we don't use white paint ordinarily other than to cover up mistakes. One of the reasons for that is that white paint is of course opaque and a bit chalky. And one of the beauties of watercolour is that we tend to want transparency of our colours. We do use some opaque colours, sure, but we want transparency, because what that means is the paper kind of shows through a little bit, you know, in that the layer of paint is very thin, so the light hitting the paper reflects back, and that's called a luminosity, the idea that we can see light in the painting, which you don't get with acrylic or gouache or anything else. So we don't really use white. We also don't really use black, and you'll always find black included in a lot of sets, and there's actually more than one black. Now, when I say we don't use black, that's a big fat lie. We don't use blacks from the set. We do use them occasionally. There are some specialist applications where Payne's grey, lamp black, ivory black, bone black, and so on are used, but they're really for more advanced painters. In the beginning, you use something called a chromatic black. That is to say, a chromatic neutral. That is to say, you're going to mix something yourself that is black, but you do it using colours. So I'm going to cover a little bit of colour theory and a little bit of painting technique just to get you on the road with starting a bit of watercolour. And then I'm going to do a little tutorial for something you can paint yourselves that you can try out. So I'm going to use a brush today. I'm going to use a size 8. No, I'm not going to use a sable actually, because that's the wrong. Because I'm working from pans, I actually want to use a synthetic brush actually. Minimise the amount of water I'm using because I'm trying to show you things that will help you. So let's try and find. There we go. So I'm using a size 9 Dalon, so kind of like the size 8 that you'd be using. And what I'm going to do first of all, and this is what you should also do, is when you've got your pans out, you take some water in a mister bottle. Don't buy the ridiculously expensive mini misters from Ranger or Tim Holtz. Go to the pharmacy or somewhere similar. They sell these for travelling, so you can put them on aeroplanes because they're 100 millilitres. Get one of those, fill it with tap water and just squirt over. Now, a little point if you live in a hard water area. Some paints are what we call granulating colours, which I've already mentioned. If you live in a hard water area, that granulation will be slightly exaggerated. If you don't like that and you find it to be a problem, go to, I mean, in the UK, the store would be Halfords, the kind of stores that sell car accessories, or a garage would sell it as well, and get a bottle of distilled water or deionized water. For all intents and purposes, they're the same thing in regard to this kind of work, and you can get a big pint kind of bottle for £2 or £3, so $3 or $4, and that'll last you a good while. Using distilled water instead of tap water if you live in a hard water area will kind of de-exaggerate that granulation. Alternatively, if you live in a very soft water area and you're finding that you don't get good granulation at all, you could try adding a tiny bit of Epsom salts to your painting water, or you could try adding a little bit of slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, if you can get hold of it, just a tiny bit into your painting water, and experiment with it using French ultramarine or ultramarine until you get the granulation at a level you're comfortable with. So just that's a little aside, and that's there if you're painting with ultramarine and you can't see the granulations everyone sees in tutorials. If you can't see it, that's how to get round it. Do note that the ultramarine in the Cotman set is a real ultramarine, it's not a hue, so you should still see it. So the difference between the paints in the Cotman set versus Pro, apart from the presence of some hues, is most of them contain an extender. So they have something added to pad out the colour and make it go further. The reason for that is that when you buy professional paints, they are sold in 4 series. So everything in Series 1 is one price, everything in Series 2 is another price, etc, etc. Series 4 paints are a lot more expensive per unit than Series 1 paints. With the student paints, they want to get everything in the same price, because having it all the same price makes life a lot easier for a student or a beginner to try the full range of colours, and it also makes them easier to sell and manufacture. So they're padded out in some cases, not all, but some of them are padded out, and you can see it. Sometimes they look a little bit chalky, but I'll explain as I go along. Now, if you haven't got the Cotman set and you've got a different beginner's set, there are alternative warm and cool colours that you could use. So let's do the reds first of all. Cadmium red hue, or a cadmium red, is usually the warm red most people tend to start with. There are alternatives to that, but that's what most people would use. And as your cool red, alizarin crimson or permanent rose would be the 2 really obvious ones to use. So let's pop those down and we'll see how it looks. Now you're going to need 2 jars of water when you paint watercolour as a minimum. One jar is the jar you wash your brush in, the other jar is the jar you get your water from, because of course water makes up a significant part of our painting. Many people will be going, but he said don't use white, how do I make lighter colours? You just add more water, and by doing that you spread the pigment out further and the paper shows through, and that gives the impression of a lighter colour. So let me just get first of all my cadmium red hue onto the page and we'll have a look at how that looks. So I'm going to paint one area of it, and I might need to bring you closer to it to see it properly. This is a very orangey red, and this is a hue, of course. This is not the real thing. The real thing is fairly opaque. The real thing granulates a little bit, and of course is very expensive. It's what's known as a Series 4 colour, so it would cost about 10 to 20 times more per half pan than you're paying when you buy your Cotman paints. So I've painted a triangle of that, and I could now paint my cool red next door to it, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave a gap and I'm going to paint my warm yellow, which is my cadmium yellow hue, adjacent. The reason for this is we never paint 2 wet colours adjacent to each other because of a problem called backrun happening, and we don't like it when that happens, so we would normally try to avoid painting 2 colours near each other. So again, cadmium yellow, true cadmium yellow, is very expensive, opaque, slightly granular, and it does something called lifting, which means we can get it back off the page relatively easily, which we can't do with the hue. The hue will, what we call stain, it will want to stay on the paper. So I've just put a triangle on there, and that's quite an orangey yellow, and I will take the camera down to the page in a moment so that you can see just how orangey yellow this is. And this little colour wheel exercise is a nice way to start yourself off. Now I would ordinarily put the cool yellow adjacent, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to again leave a gap, and I'm going to paint up here my cool blue, and that's my intense blue, or my phthalo blue as it's sometimes called. The reason it's called that is the dye that's used is one of the phthalocyanine colours, and it's written PHTH at the beginning, and a lot of people pronounce that phthalo blue, but it's actually pronounced phthalo. So it's an F and then a TH very close together, phthalo. It's almost like the F is kind of forgotten in your mouth, so it's phthalocyanine. It's the same as the middle part of phenolphthalein, phtha. So a lot of people say that wrong. So if you want to make yourself sound a bit more impressive, say phthalo properly. and you'll probably make people think you know more than you do. Now, this cool blue is very intense. You can see it. It's a really intense blue. So we always have to be very careful when we use it to make sure we don't overload mixes of colours. So one thing you have to remember is that not all paints have an equal what we call pigment load. So the amount of pigment in the paints is very different. The Cad Red Hue doesn't have a lot of pigment compared to the phthalo. So if you were mixing the two together, you'd have to make sure you put a bit more red paint to cancel out a bit more of the blue. So again, I won't put in my warm blue. What I'm going to do now is, now this is getting dry, I'll put in my warm red, my cool red. Now I'm going to put the back of my finger on here, and if this feels cooler than the surrounding paper, it's still wet, but it's pretty much dry, so I can continue. And I'm now going to be using alizarin crimson, so that is a nice purpley red, a pinky red as some people call it, and it's a little bit subdued. It's actually not my personal cool red of choice. I prefer Permanent Rose myself, but if we're going to use that Cotman set as our kind of surgery set, if you like, I'm going to use this, and I'm going to make them run together. I'm going to not leave a gap. Let's get them quite close, because that'll allow you to make better comparisons. Now, while I just wait a moment, because I can see the yellow is really wet, and I want to prevent what's called a back run, what I will do is I will paint a little bit of Permanent Rose nearby, just to show you this is what Permanent Rose would look like. It's a much, I don't know if you can see that actually, I can't even see the screen on the camera, I think you can see there. It's a much brighter, almost lighter colour, but there's not much difference in it when we're working with the Cotman paints, because they're obviously not the best quality in the world. If we were, that would be a lot lighter. Now, my yellow is getting there. You should really only touch with the back of your hands, because the grease off your fingers can cause no end of problems. Now, I'm just scrubbing off some contamination on my yellow. A lot of people worry about this, about getting a little bit of blue on the top of the yellow. They think they've ruined it. You can just wipe it off with a wet brush. It's really not a big deal. I should say that the technique we're actually painting, of wet paint on dry paper, has a name. This is called wet on dry painting, and it's one of many techniques we use in watercolour, but it's actually not the best one. It's a technique a lot of beginners use because they don't know about anything else yet, but I'm going to show you some other things. The problem with it is it doesn't really sing. It doesn't really show off watercolour for what watercolour is, so I will show you in a moment how to really use your watercolours. And now I'm putting in that wonderful warm blue, French ultramarine, or this is ultramarine, but the professional one is called French ultramarine because of the way it's made. And that's what we call a granulating blue. So that is going to settle in the paper and form into lumps. The paper I'm using is a type of paper called cold press paper, and I should say all beginners should be using cold press paper. Don't buy hot press, which has a smooth surface. It's called HP, hot press. Cold press, called CP or NOT, N-O-T, has got a rough surface, and it's much easier to control the water on a rough surface. You may not believe that, but it is. There is another paper called rough or extra rough, which has got a really bumpy surface. I don't recommend that for beginners. That's a little bit more down the line when you get a bit more advanced. So let's not worry too much about that yet. Now, I could, if I wanted to, between this purpley blue and this, purpley blue and bluey purple, I could paint three colours. I could paint a purple, a bluey purple, and a reddy purple. And I think I might do that. And if you're going to do this exercise at home, you should do that. You should do all three. Now, if you were to go to my website, which is the-spin-doctor.co.uk, go into the download section, you can actually download a template for this that you can paint on or copy onto paper, and it's got all the instructions for what colours you should use and mixes and everything. And it's got some more advanced mixes for more advanced painters that use different primaries, so you could try that if you wanted to. Now, I'm going to do the opposite of what you'd normally do. Rather than mix the colours on the palette and paint it on, because that's what we would normally do in a colour wheel, I'm going to demonstrate a type of painting called wet into wet. So first of all, I'm going to wet a triangular area of paper. And you won't be able to see how wet this is on the camera. But really what I'm doing is I'm just wetting that area like a slice of pizza. And it's now shiny. You can see it on the camera because I'm using slightly dirty water. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called dropping. I'm going to just pop some French ultramarine around one edge and another edge there. And I'm going to pop a bit more along the middle. Now this won't spread very far. That's a sign of a student paint. A professional grade paint would spread really easily and it would shoot across and leave us with lots and lots of paint. And I'm now going to pick up some alizarin crimson, and it's important when you do this that you get the paint pretty wet. You don't use it too sticky. And I'm going to drop that along this edge. And this wet into wet painting style will allow these two colours to mix naturally, but I'm going to just encourage them along the middle because these are student paints. They're not going to necessarily mix to the best of their abilities, so I'm just going to nudge them a little bit around the middle, and I'm going to let them do their thing now. I'm going to leave them, I'm going to let them spread out, and we'll see how they look when they finish doing it. And I'm going to do the same thing on these other areas. I'm going to paint in with water here, and I'm going to put in cad yellow, and that water is slightly pink because it's dirty water. I'm going to put in my cad yellow along this edge. And then I'm going to put in my cad red along the other, and I'm going to let them mix. And the advantage of letting them mix is simply that we get really almost a more natural mix because we're letting the colours mix and mingle, and where they do mix and mingle we'll be able to see the product a little more easily. Now, cadmium yellow doesn't have as much pigment in it as cadmium red, so I'm going to have to go over that with the yellow again. I can see the orange developing nicely there though, and I'm going to do my last one, which is the phthalo blue with the lemon yellow, and I'm going to put a lot of lemon yellow down, and I'm going to not do wet into wet in the same way. I'm going to paint a wet triangle of lemon yellow. Rather than putting down water and dropping in, I'm just going to paint a wet triangle of lemon yellow, and I'm going to drop straight into it that intense blue. And the reason I've chosen to do it this way is because of the intensity of that intense blue. It's a good way to control it, is to just avoid that extra step. So I'm going to let that spread out and mix now. So I've got an orange, a purple, and I will soon have a green. It's a very bluish green. I'm just going to nudge it with a wet brush to just encourage it to mix. And again, this is a good exercise for you when you're beginning to do a little bit of A, colour theory, and B, a little bit of brush control. Now I'm going to do some more mixes. Rather than mixing a warm yellow and a warm red to get orange, let's see what happens when we mix a cool yellow and a cool red. I'm going to mix them in a little square of water, and I'm going to pop some lemon yellow in. And I've painted about 2/3 of that wet area with lemon yellow. And now I'm going to pick up some alizarin crimson. And I'm going to pop that along the other edges. And mix it into that lemon yellow. And we do get a sort of an orange. But it's not a lovely bright orange, a sunny orange like the one we've just had. Just going to mix in a little bit more. It's a dull orange. It's actually a more realistic orange. So let's see what happens if we do the same here with, again, our opposite kind of colours. So rather than mixing the bluey red and the reddy blue to make a purple, what happens if we mix the greeny red, the greeny blue, with the yellowy red? Let's see what happens there. So I'm going to pop the cadmium red in first. Remembering that the phthalo blue is really intense, I want to get a lot of red down first. And I'm just going to dot in the tiniest amount of this phthalo blue, just along that edge, just to let it mix in with a wet brush. I'm not painting perfectly here. I'm not even painting particularly well here. I'm doing this to show you colours rather than anything else. And finally, rather than making our green using the bluey yellow and the yellowy blue, let's use the warm yellow and the warm blue and see what kind of green we get there. And you're going to notice something common about these three colours that we're mixing. So I'm going to put in the ultramarine blue first of all. And then we want the cadmium yellow. And I'm just going to mix them on the page. This sort of mixing on the page is quite a good way to mix with watercolours, really. And you'll notice that that is not a very pretty green. It is a green, but it's a very, what we would call a muddy green, to mean sort of earthy looking. Now I'm going to take you down so you can look at it. Let's just loosen off the camera. Okay, let's have a look at what we've got here. So you can see when we mixed the cool yellow and the cool red, the warm yellow and the warm red, we got this lovely warm orange here, almost like embers, really beautiful. Where we mixed the yellowy blue, the cool blue and the cool yellow, we got this lovely green, quite a nice green. When we mixed the warm blue and the cool red, we got that fantastic purple. It's a lovely winey kind of purple in the middle. But it doesn't really cover everything. What happens when we mix those other pairs? So let's compare this yellow here we made using a reddy yellow and a yellowy red with the one with the bluey red and the bluey yellow. Still pretty, but it's much more subdued. It's a much more muted orange. Let's have a look at that purple that we made. Again, it's a muted purple when we compare it with this purple that sort of sings to us. And the green is a muddy, sludgy green compared with this pretty nice bright green. That is because we have mixed colours that are further apart on the colour wheel effectively. If you mix colours close together, a warm yellow with a warm red, you get a nice colour. If you mix further away and further away, you get a muddy colour. And the reason for that is that in here, let's look at this one. We've mixed a yellow with a bit of red in it, with a red with a bit of yellow in it. So the only colours that are actually there are red and yellow. If we mixed a yellow with a bit of blue, a cool yellow, and a red with a bit of blue, a cool red, what we're mixing is red, yellow and blue. And when you mix the three colours together, you get a muddy tone. Now that we can actually use to our advantage because not many colours in nature are that bright. Very often you want the more subdued colour. So this kind of brings us on to the concept of chromatic neutrals and mixing your own blacks. So I'm going to make an example mix of all three colours. I'm going to mix first of all the three warm colours and then all the three cool colours, and you could as an exercise do all the combinations for fun, just to see how they work. So I'm going to put in some ultramarine blue and I'm just going to throw that on in a rough triangle, and I'm going to use some cadmium yellow hue again in a rough triangle, and then I'm going to put in some cadmium red. Oops. Just a sort of blob, and clean my brush off because I'm not trying to make a perfect black here. I'm trying to demonstrate a principle to you. Let's mix those in, and you can see quite quickly we're getting a neutral. Now it's got a bit of a red bias to it at the moment, so if I add a little bit more blue, there we go. It's a brownish black, but it's there. And you can see that. Now, that's a warm chromatic neutral. Let's see what a cool one's like. And I'll mix that just above here where we can see it. So first of all, some of that lemon yellow. and then some alizarin crimson. I'm going to add the blue last because it's really easy to put too much blue with phthalo blue, or intense blue as it's called. If you have professional colours, phthalo blue is called Windsor blue when you buy it from Winsor & Newton, but it's all the same thing. Okay, let's mix that in together, and you can see I have probably overloaded that blue, definitely. Yeah, the mud is starting to appear, the chromatic neutrals there. There's a little bit too much blue, so add a bit of red and knock back that blue. We've now got a little bit too much blue, so I'll add a little bit of cadmium yellow, and there we are. There is our cooler neutral mix. Now they're pretty ugly, but they're actually pretty useful, because it's not often in nature you actually will see a black. It's not often in nature you will ever see a white either, and that's why people often panic about the need to have a white paint. You don't actually need one. The reason manufacturers put them in the sets is A, it's really cheap to manufacture. It's actually cheaper to make white than any other colour. So they will put it in to make you think you're getting value for money, but it actually means you've got one useless paint. They also put it there because people think you need a white. So if there's no white there, you won't buy the set. That's why they put it there. When you look at a white object in reality, and let's have a look at this white page. On the camera here, you've got an area here that has got a shadow over it, and an area here with a shadow over it, and those shadows have a little bit of a purple cast to them. The rest of the page has got a kind of a yellowy cast over this half, and it's only got a small area that is even close to a pure white. Let's look at a black object to compare. And I'm just going to pop this instruction manual here that's black. Most of this has got a slightly reddish cast to it because it's reflecting things over on this side, and there isn't really a pure black because there'll always be, if I hold it like this, a large element of reflection. So we don't need a black. What we need are these neutrals that we can add to other colours to dim them down, and we could have made these a lot darker. There is a common neutral that people use that is really useful to have. You'll remember in the colours I recommended, one of them was a colour called burnt sienna. So let me just pop the other colours that I recommended you had onto this paper. And I'll just move these paints over a little bit. This is burnt sienna, oops, or would be burnt sienna if I actually picked enough up on the brush to show you. This is burnt sienna. It's a slightly orangey brown. What browns really are subdued oranges. So think of it in terms of colour mixing as an orange. And mine's a little bit dirty in the pan because I've contaminated the top layer, so I had to take a bit off. The other one was yellow ochre, which is this sort of mustardy colour. Just there, just off the edge of your screen there. Let me move things over a little bit. That's a little bit thick, but it's really a sort of, yeah, there we go, pale mustard. The real use of those is for making earthy, muddy mixes. And a really useful one is a colour that hasn't got a name, but its nickname is Jane's Grey, after a painter called Jane Blundell, who nicknamed it Jane's Grey for her students. And I think it's cute, so I share that nickname. I use it as well. And that is to take burnt sienna, which is that muted orange, a dark orange, and mix it with ultramarine. So we're mixing a reddy blue with an orange. And you'll note we get this wonderful black, this wonderful dark grey. And I'll take the camera down to show it to you in a minute. It's a really neutral grey. It doesn't have a bias. But if we wanted to, we could add a little bit more burnt sienna and make it into a warm grey, or a little bit more blue and make it into a cool grey. But what have we done? Let's look at the colour wheel. If we look at where the ultramarine is, straight opposite is orange. So if we were to mix any colours across the wheel, we will get a black. So if I were to mix phthalo blue with cadmium red, we will get a black. French ultramarine with an orange, namely burnt sienna, I will get a black. A warm yellow mixed with a purple of any kind really, or a cool yellow with any purple is going to give me a black. A green mixed with any red is really going to give me a black. So if you just look at opposites on the colour wheel, they're going to give you an idea for where you can make neutrals. Let's take you down again so you can have a look at those neutrals with me. First of all, these are the ones we made by just throwing 3 colours together, and you can see they are browns. Really they are browns, but have a look at this one we just made. This is Jane's Grey. Isn't it fantastic? It's almost a perfect neutral. There's no bias to that. This one's maybe slightly blue actually, but it's a wonderful colour for rocks, it's a wonderful colour for brick walls. It's a really, really useful colour. And what you can do as a technique is if you've got these types of brush that have a plastic wedge handle, which come from Simply Simmons, they have these perspex wedges, and you put on Jane's Grey quite thickly, you can sometimes, if you're lucky, scratch into it like that, and that can enable you to make stones and walls look realistic. So that's a little special technique you could use. So that is what you use when you think you need a black. You make Jane's Grey. That's how to do it. And that's an example of something called a chromatic neutral. You've mixed some colours together, chromatic, to make a neutral, a black. Now, I'm just moving because I've got cramp in my leg and I don't want to have to stop. So I've shown you how to make a neutral. I've shown you how to make some mixes. Let's look at some basic techniques in watercolour painting. How we use the brush, how we use the colours, because you're going to need these moving forwards.